A hero of the Imperium, the undeviantly champion of the Imperium, and hero of the Angevin crusade in the Calixis Sector, liberating planet after planet, fighting with fervor, pride and faith, Duke Severus, first of his name, would fall in one of the greatest betrayals in Imperial record. This is the story of the Severan Dominate. Welcome back, my friends, as we once again dive deep into Imperial history, into the still ongoing, to this day, sectarian conflict that started when a conglomerate of planets named the Severan Dominate decided to claim itself independent of the Imperium. Remember, if you enjoy the content, please leave a like, subscribe, and share a comment of what you think about this ongoing rebellion within the Imperium's borders. Now let's get to it. The Calixis Sector was carved from the Xenos-infested depths of the unexplored region of the Segmentum Obscurus, formerly known as the Calixis Expanse, by the blood, sweat, and tears of countless thousands of Imperial martyrs and millions of brave soldiers who fought in the Angevin crusade nearly 2,000 standard years ago. It took the combined efforts of numerous arms of the Imperium's military machine to accomplish such a monumental task. The elite Adeptus Astartes led hundreds of regiments of the Astra Militarum across worlds seething with Xenos corruption. As numerous warships as the stars themselves burned across the universe, the skies were darkened by the Imperial Navy's swarming fighter wings. The war machines of the Adeptus Titanicus rode the battlefields like armored gods, while the private armies of the most ambitious rogue trader houses fought in the hope of one day dominating the worlds reclaimed from the Xenos fiends. One of these militant rogue trader nobles led the boldest incursions into the region, advancing so far into the Calixis Expanse that he almost reached the wilderness zones beyond. This individual was Duke Severus, first of his name, the holder of a warrant of trade bestowed on his family by the High Lords of Terror centuries ago. However, his name is virtually obscure in the Calixis Sector, whereas the achievements of lesser men and women are celebrated across 100 or more systems. The heroic deeds of Severus I and his companions should be celebrated not only in the Calixis Sector, but throughout the entire Imperium. Duke Severus was responsible for unlocking the Marcane Marches subsector by plasma boiling the repulsive Xeno-spawning seas of Cantus Extremis, allowing 3 million Imperial troops to advance. Severus was the one who discovered and charted the warp route between Drea and Iacanthos when the fleet masters of the Imperial Navy believed the path must lie between the Prol system and Fedrid. It is even said that a massive warp creature attacked the Duke's flagship as he approached Gumph Magna, wrapping its tentacles so tightly around it that when Severus ordered an emergency translation into real space, the creature was drawn through as well. The beast was ultimately vanquished after being weakened by exposure to the material realm's laws. Before it ceased to exist, however, Duke Severus excavated a single crystalline eye measuring several meters in diameter and valued at the ransom of a High Lord of Terror. Despite his numerous victories, it was the Duke's actions in forging the Periphery Subsector that brought him fame, if only temporarily. Few extant archives reveal the heretic and Xenos foes the Duke's fleet confronted as it ranged ahead of the main Angevin crusade advance between Severus Secundus and Sinofia, as the Inquisition and other entities deemed such information unfit for public dissemination. In the majority of cases, only the names of previously unknown battles remain. The scouring of Cyclopea 9, the Kulth landings, the retreat from Avitahol, closely followed by the Avitahol reprisals, and the War of Ash, in which 1,000 Xenos vessels are said to have been sent plummeting into the upper atmosphere of Sisk, with the survivors being relentlessly hunted by vengeful human natives. Duke's greatest moment occurred during the Second Battle of Kulth, when his armies were counterattacked by millions of slavering Xenos monstrosities. A faded entry in a crumbling tome sealed in the stasis vaults beneath the Lucid Palace on Scintilla states that the Duke personally rallied his armies as the Xenos horde closed in and all seemed lost. The unknown scribe goes on to claim that Duke Severus confronted a Xenos creature of such monstrous nature that his greatest champions were driven insane, but that he himself was unaffected, delivering the decisive blow himself and turning the tide of the battle and the entire campaign in an instant. Human-held worlds that had resisted the Imperium's advance capitulated after the Xenos legions were defeated. The region that would become the Periphery Subsector was opened up, and a warp route was discovered that connected it to the distant Scarus sector,
ensuring the region's prosperity as shipping centers sprang up along its length. Why, then, are the accomplishments of Severus the first unknown to the inhabitants of the Calixis Sector? The answer is straightforward and resides in the most fundamental human flaw: hubris. The provisions of Duke Severus I's warrant of trade promised him much, but the High Lords of Terror never expected him to survive the dangers that lurked in the Calix expanse. Prior to receiving his title, the Duke was a senior courtier of the Senatorum Imperialis on Terra, and his political trajectory was leading him to a seat on that council's highest body. This greatly disturbed his numerous rivals, who believed that Severus had murdered many of his countrymen during his ascension to power. These adversaries orchestrated the issuance of the warrant of trade, compelling Severus to embark on a crusade that they hoped would end his ambitions, career, and life. Severus was aware of the High Lord's intentions, and when he successfully carved the Periphery from the darkness of the Calix expanse, he interpreted the terms of his warrant to justify claiming it as his personal realm, exempt from the laws and demands imposed on the rest of the Imperium. In essence, Severus established himself as the sole ruler of his own private dominion within the boundaries of the Imperium, which, in his mind, he had earned through the sacrifice of his and countless thousands of his followers' lives. In different circumstances, Severus I might have been permitted to realize his ambition, as the Imperium's borders are frequently expanded by individuals with similar desires for greed and power, only to be absorbed by the greater bulk of sectors generations later. This would have been the case with Severus if not for the rise of a man who viewed him as a vainglorious and self-serving robber baron, intent on expanding his domains on the blood, perspiration, and tears of millions of the God Emperor's loyal servants. This individual was Lord General Militant Drusus, who succeeded Lord General Militant Golgena Angevin as the military leader of the Angevin Crusade that conquered the Calix expanse. While Severus was conquering the Periphery for his own purposes, Drusus led the Astra Militarum armies to a succession of victories equally as glorious as those won by the Duke. While Severus worked to consolidate his power after the Second Battle of Kulth, Drusus continued to fight for the God Emperor of mankind, claiming uncountable worlds. Following his apparent death at the hands of rival agents, which may or may not have included Severus, and subsequent resurrection, Drusus was beatified by the ecclesiarchy as a living saint, and is still revered as the patron saint of the Imperium in the Calixis Sector. Duke Severus was quickly overshadowed by Saint Drusus, and his intentions to found his own realm were reduced to ashes. Due to the fact that all of the prominent figures of the Angevin Crusade openly revered Drusus as the embodiment of the Emperor's justice, none of them would support Severus's own ambitions. Severus turned his back on his erstwhile peers in the Angevin Crusade for a time, eventually communicating only with the renowned rogue trader Sibylline Harlock. It is unknown what transpired between the two, but some believe that Harlock denounced Severus upon learning of his plans to establish his own private dominion. Severus was in ruins by the time Drusus was proclaimed the first Lord of Calixis. He died in 417 M39, less than one solar month before Drusus's own demise.
The cruelty of fate transformed him from a patrician merchant admiral into a paranoid recluse, and he remained a resentful, bitter man to the end. Severus's greatest limitation was his gluttony and the hoarding of glory, medals, and self-absorbed arrogance. As he chose to consolidate his holdings in Calixis instead of continuing his mission to expand the sector, this would be the beginning of this sad affair. Duke Severus I was not the final member of his lineage, however. Before he passed away, he recounted his sorrowful story to his eldest son, and in the telling it must have been distilled into a vicious tale of inferior men forming an alliance against a rival out of jealousy. The descendants of the first Duke Severus descended into a family of marginal influence and power without their warrant of trade or the ability to claim new domains and titles. Their resentment grew with each succeeding generation as their desire for what they perceived to be their just reward remained unfulfilled. They felt all their work, sacrifice and blood were for nothing more than to pay the enormous tithe to the administratum. The son relayed the story to his son, and once again the tale was distorted in the telling until only a contorted kernel of truth remained.
Generation after generation of the House Severus heard and retold this tale of calamity until 779 M41, when Duke Severus XIII seized control of the remnants of his family. In contrast to his predecessors, Severus XIII had climbed the ladder of power in the Calixis Sector, utilizing unidentified methods and means. Duke Severus XIII, the most recent heir to the Severus family, was appointed Lord Subsector of the Periphery. Even as Lord Sector Marius Hax of Calixis granted him the title, he feared the appointment could have grave consequences. However, Hax was compelled to make the selection. Severus had spent his entire existence building a formidable network of allies on the periphery. A few high-ranking members of the Adeptus Arbites within the Calixis Sector were among his most important allies. The Duke utilized these connections to eradicate political rivals, while simultaneously ensuring his own official records appeared spotless. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence that Severus may have planted witnesses, falsified documents, and even sponsored assassinations against some of the most loyal noble families in the Periphery Subsector. Kulth is a war world and the erstwhile capital of the Periphery Subsector of the Calixis Sector. It is the capital of the secessionist Severan Dominate and the most significant theatre of the Spinward Front at present. Kulth is the strategic fulcrum of the Spinward Front, as it holds a distinct position vis-à-vis the numerous factions seeking to conquer the periphery. Let's stop for a minute, as it is crucial to know what is the Spinward Front. The Spinward Front is an Imperial war zone comprising dozens of star systems devoured by conflict between diametrically opposed factions of humans and Xenos. It is centered on a subsector of the Calixis Sector within the Segmentum Obscurus, known as the Periphery. The vast majority of the Spinward Front war zone is off the map in unexplored regions of the Calixis Sector. It encompasses a region that is directly in the path of a sizable Orc invasion, as well as a region that is under attack from traitorous secession and other Xenos and Chaos incursions. There are as many opportunities for triumph and death on the Spinward Front's numerous and diverse battlefields. The weak will fall prey to Orcs, dissidents, Drukhari, and even the terrifying forces of the ruinous powers. Now let us continue. Nobody knows what would have happened if Severus's fiefdom had gone unchecked. Perhaps he would have grown bold enough to openly declare secession, or perhaps his unseen allies would have turned against him in their arrogance. Instead, another Xenos species made the final decision. An Orc assault headed by warlord Genghis Grimtooth, the self-titled Git Slaver, slammed into the farthest reaches of Severus's micro-empire, slaughtering millions in a few solar months. The Planetary Defense Force forces on these worlds were mostly focused on suppressing their own populations or on blustering parades celebrating their lord in House Severus, and few were capable of mounting anything resembling a credible response. As the Git Slavers Orcs rampaged unabated into Severus's domain, world after world slipped from his control.
There was nothing he or his evil allies could do to stop them. As millions died, Severus XIII sat on his granite throne and brooded. His closest advisors advised him to seek assistance from the Imperium, but the executioner's strike silenced them all. Finally, his counselors were all dead or had fled, leaving Severus alone and his kingdom on the verge of collapse. In a terrible realization, he realized that they had all been correct. He sent his own people to the court of Calixian Lord Sector Marius Haxon Scintilla to ask for assistance against the Orc invasion. Despite the fact that the bulk of the messengers were assassinated by unidentified assassins or died in other, equally lethal ways, one made it through. Severus's granddaughter went to Sector Lord Hax and begged for help. Hax only laughed at her. The patrician Calixian sector governor had been observing the periphery from afar for years and was well aware of Severus XIII's betrayal, but he did not indicate how much he was aware of its origins. Later rumors suggested that some link between Severus and Hax, some evil tie, possibly even a blood tie, held Severus back as he constructed his own secret kingdom. When the Orcs struck, it was to Hax's advantage because it humbled Severus and pushed him out of the wilderness in public. Finally, Hax decided that the Orcs needed to be checked and the Calixis Sector's military reserves were activated. Kulth, the Periphery Subsector's capital, was relieved, albeit the Imperium never committed enough force to fully reverse the tide against the Orcs.
The worlds beyond the Periphery had sunk into a roiling cauldron of complete war, yet so many Calixian troops were being committed to the covert battle in the Jericho Reach that many in the sector's highest Imperial circles saw little prospect for success in the Periphery. Some speculated that those who prosecuted the distant Achilles Crusade needed a battle closer to home to cover the massive drain on resources, and therefore a standoff in the Periphery was at best convenient and at worst purposefully fostered. Knowing that the people of the Periphery were staunch followers of the Imperial creed, Duke Severus had to concoct a story to persuade them to support his wish for secession from the Imperium. Their trust was far too strong to be readily undermined. When the Orcs attacked and the Astra Militarum retaliated, the Duke's timeline had to be significantly accelerated. He didn't have the time he had planned to employ to bribe government officials and manipulate the populations of his worlds. Instead, he needed to invent an issue that would instantly unify the peoples of the newly formed Severan Dominate against the monolithic Imperium of Man. The motivation had to be exceedingly compelling, and all indications had to point to the fact that the time for peaceful settlement had long passed. With this attitude in mind, the Duke devised a fabricated story concerning supply constraints. Severus proceeded to deliberately redirect the majority of all shipments of food, equipment, and other vital supplies away from the Periphery's highly reliant worlds. Without those imports, these barely self-sufficient worlds struggled to exist, especially during some of the more perilous seasons when locally produced items were in short supply. Simultaneously, he began to raise the tides of military units and supplies required from those worlds. Under the guise of providing additional soldiers for Imperial legions, the Duke began to extend the roster of his private armies. He chose the strongest and brightest young warriors from other worlds, rapidly expanding his troops while hobbling the workers on many of his home worlds. In a few cases, he even synchronized his unit removal with new slave strikes by the Children of Thorns. This confluence of circumstances conspired to make life miserable for the majority of peripheral people. As the residents of these worlds saw their crucial imports dwindle, their manufacturing capacity was weakened by the loss of a large portion of their workers. This heightened the sense of restlessness. As some worlds faced starvation, labor strikes broke out in others due to very dangerous working conditions. In a few cases, cults arose that taught about the Imperium's ills, promising redemption to those willing to accept their immoral cause. In a handful of solar months, once abundant worlds were on the verge of catastrophic political and social collapse. Duke Severus used meticulous monitoring to detect when each of the planets was approaching a tipping point. He had to be assured that the vast majority of the inhabitants of each planet were totally disillusioned.
Out of true desperation, these folks had to be enraged and ready to take spectacular and foolish action. When it became evident that the population was on the edge of a revolution, the Duke swooped on each globe with a generous interim bounty of supplies and an appropriate force of troops to distribute crucial items while also preventing a revolution. As Severus attempted to pacify the populace, he made certain that any credit for the deliveries fell entirely on his shoulders. The generosity he had plainly contrived at each other's expense became a proof of his morality rather than an evidence of his deceit. While his reputation grew among the populace, the Duke blamed the shortages and interminable tithes on the high lords of distant terror. Duke Severus feigned to be a hesitant hero in his early pleadings. He reminded the citizens of the Imperial cause's grandeur and importance. He lectured at length about the galaxy's inherent problems, stressing that it was only the immortal Emperor's grace that saved humanity from Xenos and other horrors. Of course, this was only the beginning. Worlds invariably played into his hands, praising the Duke for his goodness while condemning the Imperium's seemingly unending avarice. On certain worlds, the Duke's supporters had to plant dissidents among the populace in order to start the cries of secession. Surprisingly, this was unneeded on countless occasions. Even in these regions where the population remained devoted to the Imperial creed, there were individuals who were willing to remain true to their faith while abandoning their loyalty to the Imperium's government. On each planet, the Duke decided to explore secession as a last resort, only after all other options for discussion had been exhausted. When the emergency supplies he had provided ran out, Duke Severus called on the governments of each planet to join him in the construction of a new government. The Duke,
clearly a cunning politician and a gifted actor, pretended that each globe would be the first to join his new federation against the Imperial cause. In each case, the people felt they were putting their lives and possessions into a worthwhile cause that they had personally helped to develop. This gave them a sense of ownership, which strengthened their readiness to sacrifice even more than they had previously sacrificed, under the guise that they or their children might eventually enjoy more freedom than the Imperium allowed. As the legal imperial ruler of the worlds in the Periphery Subsector, the Duke had the full support of the Imperium of Man to propagate his deceptive lies to the public at first. This information came in handy when he told his tales. The Duke was able to ensure that people within existing imperial organizations continued to follow his directions or were replaced by those eager to do so through his network of existing allies. He was able to regulate off-world communication and trade, ensuring that only communications he wanted to transmit reached each globe and that only commodities shipped with his approval were delivered. Eventually, the Duke had to replace a large number of adepts who stayed loyal to the Imperial cause even when they faced death. Despite this, he kept enough of the pre-existing systems in place that word of the Imperium's tyranny and his own just revolution spread to the inhabitants of the worlds he had ruled. While the situation on Kulth was improving, Severus XIII's conflict in the Periphery was deteriorating. While the Orcs pillaged Deluge, KW9, Pertinax, and a slew of other star systems, a slew of new threats emerged. Despite the pacts Severus thought he had made with the Drukhari, the poisonous children of Comera conducted progressively more brazen incursions against the peripheral worlds on the point of war. The warband of Chaos Space Marines, under the command of Sektoth, the False Whisperer, launched a number of violent assaults while pursuing their own blasphemous missions as a result of the Imperium's dominance in the region almost completely collapsing. Besieged from all sides, Severus XIII declared his personal annexation of the chaotic zone of space beyond the periphery into the Severan Dominate until the crisis subsided. Lord Sector Hax was enraged, labeling Severus a secessionist and a traitor, and the battle erupted to unprecedented levels. The minions of chaos now wander openly across the war-torn worlds, performing their lord's unfathomable bidding, while the Drukhari attack anywhere they want, their covenant with Severus XIII all but ripped apart.
Severus also understood that his newly devoted population would accept the war's necessity because he had ensured that they all believed it was their last true shot at survival. However, he considered that the promise of survival was insufficient. He instead chose to entice them with the prospect of a wonderful utopia. The Duke believed that such a promise would generate a citizenry that was considerably more prepared to accept short-term sacrifices in the hope of paving the way for a paradisiacal future. With this in mind, the Duke has made promises to each country that are both fiscally and politically impossible to keep. These begin with the fundamental notion that the Severan Dominate's worlds will be affluent beyond their wildest dreams. The Duke has vowed that marvelous archaeotechnology will provide for all, so that all residents will be able to enjoy a plethora of meals and comforts, and that military service obligations may even be abolished. Of course, all of his guarantees come with the condition that his people must first achieve victory. Although his promises are obviously difficult to keep, the Duke has worked hard to create the appearance that he can. As a result, he has used the resources he had stockpiled long before the revolution began to demonstrate his sincerity. While those early reserves were substantial, they were insufficient to sustain a generous dividend permanently. Indeed, as a result of some of the agricultural losses incurred during the early fighting, these reserves are becoming increasingly scarce by the day. Only the Duke's most trusted associates are fully aware of the situation. In contrast, the typical dominant citizen has become extremely dedicated to the Duke due to early indications that he may be able to take his world to new heights, transforming the periphery into a shining model of an idealized human civilization. Cults have even formed among ardent adherents of the Imperial Creed on a few worlds, declaring the Duke to be a prophet of the immortal Emperor. These believers think that anyone who can turn a dire circumstance into one of limitless opportunity must be guided by his heavenly hand. Another difficulty is that the Duke has promised unparalleled levels of personal freedom to the populace. Within the Imperium, such liberties have historically varied significantly from world to world,
depending on the unique form of government of each star system, and are subject to the standards of the local adeptus arbites and ecclesiarchy prelates, but they are usually rigorous. The Duke has claimed that under his authority, everyone will have the right to choose how they spend their lives. It remains to be seen if he intends to keep these promises, but the very act of making them has captivated some while scaring others. In the absence of effective imperial oversight, few of the region's citizens realize how deadly these liberties can become. A liberal view of personal freedom may even expose the public to heresy, attracting the attention of Xenos, renegade psychers, or even the ruinous powers. While general dedication to the immortal emperor may prevent such a crisis, some may even begin to push for religious liberty, undermining the imperial creed's ability to defend humanity in the region. Another source of concern is that the Duke has no intention of ever relinquishing ultimate control over these realms. He seeks to ensure that any judgments about personal liberties and government styles are congruent with his preferences. To reach this goal, he is willing and capable of lying and cheating in whatever way is necessary. In places where decisions may be decided through elections, the Duke ensures that the elections are meticulously manipulated. The Duke is ultimately responsible for planetary government's choices on hereditary, divine, or military worlds. Though he is certain to keep the illusion of choice and personal liberties alive, none have yet been implemented, and none are likely to be in the future. As of now, coming back to current Imperial time, it is unclear and quite uncertain that the Severan Dominate still stands. The Severan Dominate, the Calixis Sector, and the Coronis Expanse, from what I can determine, are all on the Imperium Nihilus side of the Great Rift. Warp travel is riskier than ever, and Chaos has almost complete freedom to raid at will. While the Imperial forces are most likely urgently trying to play damage control, the Dominate may have gained some breathing room.
Or the threat posed by the Imperial forces has been replaced by a new one, which is just as probable considering the precarious condition they were already in. In a related note, I believe the Hadex anomaly has devoured the entirety of the Jericho Reach. That said, it is quite a reach to say if the Severan Dominate has survived the 13th Black Crusade, and not only that, the Cicatrix Maledictum, and after that the enormous power of the Indomitus Crusade that sails across the Imperium bringing order to the galaxy. And now we reach the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and had fun. Let me know your opinion on the Severan Dominate and tell me if you think it still stands or what happened. Remember, if you enjoy the content, please subscribe and leave a like. We will see each other on the next one, my friends. Until then, keep the light of the Emperor burning.